A very warm welcome to Book at Lunchtime. My name's Christine Gerard. I'm the director of Torch, and I have the pleasure of welcoming my wonderful colleague, Professor Lorna Hutson from the English faculty, to discuss her, I quote, brilliant study, England's Insular Imagining, the Elizabethan erasure of Scotland. Thank you for coming today. It's a busy time of term, we know, and it's good to see so many people here. Just a brief word about Book at Lunchtime for those of you who haven't been here before, though I think most of you will have been. This has been a regular event within the Torch calendar since the inception of Torch in 2013. We have all of our sessions recorded, so it's a kind of veritable library, and if you want to go back and have a look at some really fascinating discussions, just look on our YouTube channel. So Lorna Hutson's England's Insular Imagining, the Elizabethan Erasure of Scotland has garnered some exceptional reviews. We've been doing a bit of sleuthing here, you see, and we read up on these. I quote, "This powerfully innovative book is an astonishing achievement, a masterful new literary history of English imperialism." And from the TLS, "This book will incite arguments, breed scholarship, beget articles, and enrich our understanding of a period we thought we knew well. Its discussion of 16th century uses of law, legend, and literature to claim sovereignty over a nascent English-dominated British imperial state by snuffing out any claims to independence held by Scotland and Ireland and Wales, and all this with the purpose of expelling European influence, reminds us of where we are today." Lorna Hutson has not just laid the groundwork for the next generation of critics, she has set the bar high for future interdisciplinary work in this field. Of course, that's music to our ears at Torch, because we are a platform for interdisciplinary research and have been since 2013. It seems very apt that we're featuring Lorna's book today. And I'm about to hand over to a fantastic panel, Professor Katie Murphy and Professor Mike Braddock. So I'll hand over now to Katie, who will guide us through proceedings. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Christine. Thank you all for being here. It's a real pleasure and a delight to be here to discuss Lorna's wonderful book. I'm going to introduce Lorna and Mike to you and introduce the book a little bit. And then Lorna will give us a reading, I think, from the book, and perhaps, I don't know if you're going to say anything about it as well. Mike and I will then respond to the book insofar as we are able. And then we'll have more general discussion. We'll invite questions from you as well. So first of all, Lorna, Christine has already introduced Lorna to you partially. Merton Professor of English Literature here in Oxford, scholar of early modern law and literature, women's literature, rhetoric, and the interactions more generally of literary forms of imagining and the making of social and political structures. She's published groundbreaking and award-winning books, including The Invention of Suspicion of 2007, Circumstantial Shakespeare 2015, edited the monumental Oxford Handbook of English Law and Literature 1500 to 1700, and written innumerable articles, of which I'm only going to highlight one, in part because of its wonderful and unlikely title, and in part because it's directly related to the book in hand, and that is On the Knees of the Body Politic, and it is genuinely about knees. I'm extremely grateful to Lorna for having written this book, not least for entirely idiosyncratic and personal reasons, because she is able to persuade me and justify my own personal ignorance of the history of my native country, because it is entirely attributable to my susceptibility to the great literature of the 16th and 17th centuries, as it turns out, which is good to know. And we're here to celebrate, as you've heard, England's Insular Imagining, the Elizabethan erasure of Scotland, published last year and already the recipient of the Saltire Society's prize for the best research book of 2024. It exposes the insular imagining of English literature in the later 16th and early 17th centuries. That's the way in which England was imagined as an integral island, and the fantasies of self-sufficiency, independence, and coherence which this reflects, as well as the strenuous arts of erasure required to forget that England is not a sceptred isle, a precious stone set in a silver sea, but actually cohabits the island with another sovereign nation. Beginning from two extraordinary chapters on the forgetting of the aggressive and devastating English wars against Scotland, against the Scots in the 1540s, Lorna shows how rhetorical, mythographic and literary techniques honed in response to those conflicts persist through the crises of the later 16th century and up into the 1600s. On the way, she surveys an extraordinary range of material, reading constitutional and legal texts of the period, like Henry VIII's Declaration, containing the just causes and considerations of this present war with the Scots, with the same forensic and exquisite close reading attention as the most canonical works of English literature of the period, like Spenser's Faerie Queene or Shakespeare's King Lear and Macbeth, and bringing works of Scottish legal and literary and constitutional thought, like the writings of George Buchanan and Thomas Maitland, into conversation with English constructions or deconstructions or erasures of the Scottish state. I found that attempting a summary of the detailed argument immediately becomes chronic simplification, and therefore I can only urge most emphatically that you read it yourselves. Here to discuss the book am I. I am one of Lorna's colleagues in the English faculty and a fellow in English at Oriel College. And Professor Mike Braddock, who is a senior research fellow at All Souls College, has recently joined us, and a historian of the economic, social and political history of early modern Britain, its empire and the Atlantic world, with particular interests in, and this is the title of one of his books, State Formation in Early Modern England. He's also the author of God's Fury, England's Fire, a new history of the civil wars, a useful history of Britain, suggesting that all other histories of Britain may be less so.
That's the publishers.
And forthcoming and eagerly anticipated by me, Christopher Hill, The Life of a Radical Historian, out later this year, I believe.
Next week, actually.
Next week. So more books at lunchtime, more books at lunchtime. So I'm going to hand over to Lorna first to read from the book, and then Mike and I will respond, and then we'll have a more general discussion.
Oh, well, thank you, Katie. I mean, it's really an incredible privilege for me to have a chance to discuss the book with two colleagues whose work I admire so much. And it's really wonderful to see such a lot of people here. So thank you all. I'm going to read a short extract from the book, a slightly anomalous extract, because most of the book is actually about great works of English literature and how their tropes work to make us forget that Scotland exists or was a kingdom. But this anomalously is an extract about a Scottish writer. So I'm going to read a short extract about a poem written by the around 20-year-old Scots poet Thomas Maitland, who was the son of a poet and judge, Sir Richard Maitland. And the poem's in praise of their family house of Lethington. In fact, if we could have the slide of the tower of that's the house that is in Haddington in East Lothian. The Maitland family are important because they wrote poetry, but they also made collections of earlier Scots poetry that are very important sources for medieval scholars today. And Thomas Maitland, when he wrote this poem, had just returned from studying in France, where he met Buchanan, and he writes rapturously about coming back to his beloved home. He wrote the poem in Latin, so I can't just recite it to you, but the extract I will read from is about a bit of the poem which harks back to the 1540s, when the English were invading Scotland and occupying Haddington. And the English attacked the house with firebrands. So Maitland praises the house for having a genius or spirit which protects its inhabitants and their culture. And in doing so, he makes the house an emblem of the nation of Scotland. So just before the bit I'm reading in the poem, Maitland describes a mock heroic battle of the elements of wind and rain, as you can imagine, this is Scotland, and praises the house for its victories against these elements. But then he comes on to its miraculous withstanding of a much more serious attack. But this mock battle is immediately followed by a more somber episode from the nation's and family's recent history. During the attempted English conquest of Scotland in the 1540s, as I explained in chapter 1, Scottish nobility and lairds who refused to assure or swear loyalty to the English king risked having their houses herried, ravaged and burnt, and their families harmed by English soldiers. It was extremely hard to resist the pressure to assure. Sir Richard Maitland's grandson later wrote that most part of the gentlemen of Lothian, Merse and Teviotdale did assure, but my grandfather would not assure, albeit the English did possess Haddington and Lauder. Sir Richard therefore did live at that time with very great difficulties, having a wife and many children and a great family. One of these difficulties must have been the conflagration which Lethington House narrowly escaped during the English occupation of Haddington in 1549. Once again, it is the house's genius, the tutelary guardian of the sacred temple, that is invoked as its saviour. Lethington lies about a mile south of Haddington, in the area described by Marcus Merriman as Scotland's most devastated cockpit of war. The incident the poem commemorates probably took place in Thomas's toddlerhood in September 1549. In the spring and early summer of 1548, Haddington had been fortified and was being held by the invading English forces under the command of Sir James Wilford. Actually, the next slide is a portrait of him, whose portrait with an image of the besieged town of Haddington in Scotland, not in Kent, now hangs at Courton Court in Warwickshire. The town was thought to be of great strategic importance for Somerset's conquest of Scotland. "I trust to rejoice your grace," wrote Thomas Palmer to Somerset on the 30th of June in 1548, "keeping Haddington, you win Scotland." However, in July, thousands of French and Scots cavalry and arquebusiers came with cannon to lift the siege of the town, and they were joined by the Earl of Argyll's Highlanders, whom the French marvelled at as sauvages, being naked but for their painted shirts and certain light mantles made of wool in diverse colours. The English held out bravely and with great suffering. Meanwhile, the town was slowly devastated in the ensuing crossfire of artillery and cannon, not one whole house left standing. A mile away, the Maitland's House of Lethington played its part as the military headquarters of Argyll's Highland forces. The diurnal of occurrence describes how, on the 14th of September 1549, the surrendering English fired the town and the Maitland home. The Englishmen passed out of Haddington and Brunted and Leadington, for the pest and hunger was writ evil amongst them. This must be the occasion of the miracle described by Thomas in his poem, when the Saxon enemy, as he says, heaped torches of fire and set explosives around Lethington. But wondrous to tell, the tower was not engulfed in flame, but somehow held the site of the fire in the midst of the bronze roof, as if spilling from split viscera or entrails. In this moment, as elsewhere in the poem, the tower's defensive exterior and interior genius seem to fuse. The roof's cupping and containing of the flames converts violent destruction into an image of the hearth. And as the hearth in Roman literature is the place over which the di penates, or gods of the household, stand watch, this image proposes that the house is cunningly subverting the national objectives of the enemy invasion itself, the attempt to overcome patrium et patrios populare penates, the nation and the people's penates, or national spirits. No wonder then that the poet asks if this house is to be thought not the work of man, but rather made by the hands of gods when ancient deities inhabited the Caledonian lands. Thomas's praise of Lethington brilliantly reworks a traditional conception of the Scottish nation as thriving in defiance of hostility. The tower itself, enclosing a civilized culture while withstanding the assaults of the elements, figures the nation's resistance to English attempts at conquest, while asserting the distinctive collective identity of its inhabitants. In this sense, the poem's praise of Lethington's rich and sociable interior implies another kind of nation-making, the inhabitants' collection and composition of Scots poetry. And then goes on to discuss their collection of Scots poetry. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorna. Mike, can I invite you to...
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. I'm here, I think, as a simple-minded historian. My primary reaction to the book was exactly Katie's, that it defies simple summary because the readings are so rich, as we've just seen. I think it would be very hard to render that more concisely than Lorna's done it without losing a lot of the meaning of the text and of the reading. So given that, I've decided not to engage with the close readings, but to approach it from my interdisciplinary perspective, which is more of historical sociology. My interdisciplinary team lies more in that direction, and state building and nation building and so on, and how we might create a dialogue in that direction. And from what I understand, I'm about to render simple the complex argument in exactly the way I said we can't. But Scottish and Scotch remain in, but what it's not a denial of an identity, of a distinctiveness, but of a claim to nationhood that's being erased. Yeah. So is there more you can tell us about the cultural difference that remains as a subnational identity? Is a Scot a different kind of Briton? Is a Welsh person a different kind of Briton than an English Briton? Or are they inferior versions of an English Briton and so on? Yeah.
Well, I kind of, the book ends around James's accession in a sense. So the sort of experience of sub-nationhood doesn't really get treated in it. What I was trying to do was make visible, if I can just digress slightly to say this, there's a sort of account of Scottish nationhood being this defiance of attempts to conquer. And that's the dominant mode of Scottish nationhood, as Roger Mason shows, through the medieval period, what with Edward I's attempts at conquest and so on. And then, and I couldn't really quite understand this, historians such as Colin Kidd, but many historians just seem to talk about Scottish nationhood in the late 16th century being identified with tyrannicide, with the freedom to get rid of monarchs, which of course fits with their deposition of Mary Queen of Scots. But there seems to be no room for a thinking of being Scottish that still wants a nation. And that seems to me impossible. So it seems to me that the space for thinking about that has shrunk. And the account seems to me it can't be right. And that's why I was looking at this poem, which seems clearly to articulate a sense of Scottish nationhood that is given no room in the historian's accounts, if I can put it like that. In terms of cultural difference, I mean, I think you can see laments about the sub-nation idea. I think that's in Drummond's poetry, in Fourth Feasting, for example. And I think in Sir Thomas Craig, I mean, he's quite shocked and outraged at the fact that the post-Nati, that there isn't going to be a naturalization of the Scots with the accession of James. So there's something sort of very irregular about that the people in the island are not going to have the same legal identity. And again, that seems to me something, it's not that people argue that that's okay, it's just that it seems to be an invisible problem. And what I felt I was dealing with in the book all the time were problems that didn't seem to have come to the surface of historical inquiry.
Yeah. It was striking that, and you brought it out beautifully in that reading, that the poet deplores the attack on the nation's soul, not the nation's institutions. It is an erasure of a being rather than of a political state.
I think that's true, and I would certainly think, I mean, in terms of your work and in terms of state formation, one of the things that's very striking about Scotland, that its state formation wasn't as developed, and it just didn't develop things. I mean, the English common law from a very early period develops a kind of administrative life that is enormously important and helpful in state formation terms, as people like Steve Hindle have argued. And Scotland has a lot less of that. However, it's not kind of barbaric, it does have a lot of very developed institutions, and again, that's not really picked up on.
That if I can.
Go ahead.
So that sort of predicts a second question about exactly the relative infrastructural power of the two kingdoms, as the sociologists have it. The Scottish king would have much less infrastructure or capacity in Scotland to affect the social and economic life of the kingdom by comparison with the English kingdom, so that once we'd have called that relative underdevelopment or some such. So does all this prompt, again, it's going beyond your period, but is it context for attempts at nation building in Scotland? Is there a kind of response? Because part of that infrastructural limitation in the historical literature is the residual power, say, of the Lord of the Isles, or the partial attachment of Orkney to Scotland. That there might be an internal colonisation to be done as well in order to realise the Scottish.
I think that has been treated quite a lot. I mean, I think David Armitage argues that Of course, there's Peter Marshall's recent book on Orkney, which just looks amazing, and I can't wait to read. But I think James V, who died very young, of course, was already exercising power against the Lord of the Isles, and quite a lot had been done. One of the interesting things, I haven't done much more beyond the accession of James, but one interesting thing is it's connected to the sea and to the kind of relative relationship to the sea. So, as you know, in James's reign and then in Charles's reign, Selden responds to Hugo Grotius's Mare Liberum with Mare Clausum. The sea is actually closed. The sea is actually, you can have dominion in the sea. So Grotius argues that the sea is just a place that you traverse, and that because it can't be fenced, you can't have dominion in it. And Selden argues no. And he argues very interestingly that the thing contained can have dominion over the container, so that the island of Britain has dominion over the sea. And he talks about Britain, and he talks about the crown of Britain, and all his history, Britain, Britain, Britain. There was no Britain, right? Yeah. There was no Britain because the English had absolutely refused to have Great Britain. But the rhetoric of dominion is the British crown. And then Charles, meanwhile, up in the Hebrides, this is so interesting, I think, I can't remember if it's, I've just forgotten which planet, I think it could be MacDonald, but I can't remember. Anyway, they are working with the Dutch from the Dutch West Indies to set up in Stornoway a fishery, a herring fishery. So this is very Mare Liberum, because they're just working with the Dutch and they're just doing this. And of course, the Dutch use that road. I mean, it's not remote for them. But Charles puts a stop to this because he's going to have a British fishery. But the thing about the British fishery is that the unevenness of the relationship to the sea becomes paramountly obvious, because the Scots and the Irish are not able to join because they don't have the liberties, they don't have the rights to join an English trading company because they weren't naturalised. So they say, we can't have a British fishing company because there's no Britain. And Charles is just, And anyway, then there's ship money, and we all know what happens to Charles after that. So I think that gives you an idea of what the sub-national status means. And it's so fascinating from a poetic point of view too, because then you have Milton and his poetry of like Lycidas with the genius of the shore and English freedom and so on. So it all draws on that, and he even mentions the Hebrides.
Yeah, there is a point of contact here with the modestly named Useful History of Britain. Where the point of departure for that was that the United Kingdom hasn't lasted as long as the Kingdom of Wessex, and yet we narrate our whole history as if the United Kingdom is a natural phenomenon. I speak as someone who'd like to preserve the Union, but I think it requires active preservation or not. But it's not a natural feature, whereas we've developed this myth-making that it's a natural outgrowth of the geography. And it's anything but that, really. And
yes, and I mean absolutely about the Union. But it's just good to be conscious of the history and the kind of the kind of hubris that's involved in thinking that you don't need to be. We saw what happened with Northern Ireland and the backstop and the kind of confusion about it. Yeah.
I wonder if that mention of the kind of fictive nature of the United Kingdom and the need for continual reimagining as a reassertion, if you are so inclined, of its continued existence would be a good place for me to jump in with my much more staidly written comments in response to Lorna's book, because Mike said that he was responding from his disciplinary domain of history. I'm responding from my disciplinary domain of English literature, because I want to ask Lorna about the function of literature and poetic making in the period, and how her book sits in relation to literary criticism, literary historicism, literary method. On the penultimate page of the book, Lorna cites from Victoria Cahn's book, The Trouble with Literature, pointing out that the radical constructive implications of the humanists' rhetorical conception of literature have still not been fully digested. Those are Cahn's words, quoted by Lorna. And Cahn takes literature in that book, and these are Cahn's words not quoted by Lorna, as in the broad Renaissance sense of a poetic and rhetorical technology for producing belief. And this is also the sense in which I understand Lorna to be thinking about literature as a set of techniques which, through tropes, figures, genres, narratives, make political, or rather makes political and imaginative and social worlds. And I'd love to discuss this at length, what it means, for example, for the application of the close forensic, close reading, both to Henry VIII's declaration and to the Fairy Queen, you know, apparently very different generic texts. But I'm just going to raise two things in this time. The first is the force of the word erasure in your title. And I know we were discussing before your equivocations about it.
Yeah.
I think it's a great word for you to have used, partly because of its sense of active negative, you know, the kind of the active work of erasure. In the wonderful chapter on the Fairy Queen, Lorna analyses how Spenser's erotic plots, and this relates to what you were just saying about Milton, in Book 3, situated in fairyland's estuarine and coastal regions, imagine national chastity as impregnability to outside forces and the ability to travel in order to found empires. And in order to imagine England as chaste in this sense, Spenser has to, and this is Lorna's phrase, make Scotland unimaginable. Given the problem that an inland border with a separate sovereign nation makes to imagining England as an island. Poetry is credited, this is Lorna, with being able to create new spaces and beings in the world in Shakespeare's endlessly appealing formulation to give local habitation to airy nothing. It might seem harsh to argue by contrast that poetry is also able to unmake local habitations that do exist. And one of the things that I'd like to ask you about or hear your reflections on are the kind of artistic work of unmaking, both technically and conceptually. There are two occasions in the book where you refer to the abjection of Scotland. And I wondered how forcefully you meant that term abjection, a term which has some history in literary study as a word for things which are rejected but simultaneously retained. They can't be acknowledged, but they're retained because they're too crucial to identity to be totally dismissed. And so I was interested in that kind of constructive mode of negative work that poetry does. And then the second domain that I wanted to think a little bit about was how this relates to something that you say at the end of the book, and about the relation of history, context, and literature in the period. So you refer to a kind of domain of criticism that's emerged in the last few years, mostly under the star of a critic called Rita Felsky, but a kind of post-critique. And you emphasise that a critical revelation of the covertly imperial dimensions of Elizabethan poetry and drama doesn't detract from an emotional response to that poetry and drama's aesthetic and effective richness and complexity. And I see that as a kind of manoeuvre where you're responding to post-critique's insistence that we've spent too much time uncovering the unconscious of the text that we read, too much time being suspicious of them, too much time, kind of holding them to account for the ways in which they are suspect in some sense, suspicion being one of your own critical keywords, and that we, post-critique says, should spend more time thinking about the affective responses, the emotional responses evoked in us. And what I hear you doing at that point is saying both and, there is an affective response and we need to understand how this is constructed and confected in various ways. But I wonder if this represents affect in the same way that Felsky means it, because it seems that admiring the skill with which Scotland is erased still means resisting the effective claims of the glamour of England. And I wondered if appreciating design is coterminous with or contradictory of understanding the designs that literature has on us.
That's so interesting. But, Felsky doesn't really do readings. She talks about affect and the feelings we have. And as far as I know, nobody's saying we can't have them, so I don't really know why they're being defended. I feel very excited about reading The Fairy Queen and feel very moved by it, even though I'm finding these meanings that are jurisdictional and about chastity and sea power and so on. I mean, they just seem more exciting to me that it has these meanings. And perhaps for this audience, just because it's otherwise we're talking a little abstractly, I could maybe explain a little bit about this. So part of the argument of the book is that in the 1540s, England invaded and for nearly a decade attempted to conquer Scotland in a very serious, brutal, determined way. And that, but we, as far as I know, I mean, no English literary critic ever mentions this. So there has been sort of produced a myth of indifference, as if Scotland is just there, and at a certain point, James comes south, and the two countries, you know, and it's rather annoying that he wants Great Britain, but other than that, it's mainly fine. And so the question isn't just about the war, but the question is really, how does it sort of disappear from our consciousness to this extent? Why isn't it? I mean, the texts of it were put in Holinshed's Chronicles and so on. And what I found as I was doing more and more work was that the arguments that were used to justify the war were then became the stuff of poetry, but in quite a different way. So the arguments to justify the war were taken from the 1137 text of Geoffrey of Monmouth, who argued that Britain had always been one kingdom ruled by the Britons, and there you know, various times it was disastrously divided under King Lear and under King Gorbodoc and so on. But eventually, you know, Arthur comes and beats the invading Saxons and Scots and reunites Britain and has the British Empire. And this is a Welsh story, but English kings used it from the Plantagenets onward to justify conquering Ireland, conquering Scotland, and so on. So at first, the Golfridian arguments, the Geoffrey of Monmouth arguments, are legal arguments about the right to go to war, to invade, because otherwise invasion is against the law of war. What happens, and this is what really interests me, so you have someone like Philip Sidney saying, the poet never affirmeth, the poet never lieth, because the poet never affirmeth. What happens to the Golfridian history, according to historians, is that it becomes unimportant because it becomes fiction, it becomes poetry. In my reading, it becomes much more important because it becomes fiction and poetry. So when Spencer adapts Geoffrey of Monmouth, he's not affirming that there ever was such a person as Arthur. And also, crucially, he doesn't have an argument about conquering Scotland. Just Arthur reads the book of his own life right up, and the book of the history of Britain and the book of his own life right up to the text breaks off at the point where he's just about to conquer the Scots. But he doesn't do it. The story then moves into this sort of erotic allegory of Britomart falling in love with a possible invader of the kingdom. And then it becomes all about seashores and about jurisdiction. So Spencer is doing something much more creative and poetic. And because it's not asserting anything, the way you make it come alive as a reader is to try and respond to it imaginatively and be proactive in the making of the meaning. And of course, the more you do that, the more it becomes part of you. So that's the power of literature. It's not that the way it makes Scotland disappear is just because you participate in the meaning, and that seems not to be important. And so you make this whole world and the reference of that world are structured according to how you imagine the text to be working. So it's just a very interesting kind of power. And I don't think that means I like the literature any less. I think it's really fantastic. I think it's kind of more interesting that it's got this imperial dimension than if it's just being national, you know?
Yeah. But it doesn't mean that you need to kind of... It means that as a literary critic, you as a literary critic in this book, point up the construction by which that erasure happens, and thereby you can see the construction and the erasure at the same time. Exactly. In a way that is more complicated and more interesting. Yes. Yeah.
And as for military texts, I mean, it's just amazing how many tropes and things they have.
Yeah, yeah, and this is an exemplary piece of work for precisely that kind of reading and the valences and possibilities of attentive reading for all kinds of different texts of the period. Mike, did you have any other questions or issues you wanted to raise?
I was going to give a less eloquent version of that, actually. Though it's really striking as a historian that they're so conscious of the power of rhetoric, and
Yes.
and historians are so inattentive to that, I think, normally. I would say this historian.
Well, it is interesting about the sort of strategic texts, the war texts, about how conscious they are of tropes and how tropes are so formative. I think that wasn't something I expected either.
And it's an interestingly complex dynamic of insularity within the disciplines of the academy, where, you know, literary activity spreads out across the whole domain of writing in the period.
Yes.
In a way that in our contemporary kind of divisions of labour is not necessarily recognised.
I mean, I think that's very interesting, and I think also the question of tone is interesting, because I don't think you feel permitted to read sort of irony and mockery in something like an account of a war. But William Patten's account of the war is definitely written in that kind of serio ludere way, that kind of carnival way where you're mocking the thing that you're, trying to conquer and erase. And that mockery has really, I think, been very underread in that text. Mm-hmm. So again, historians of the laws of war, like Theodore Meron, will read seriously something that Patten says about not being able to tell the noble from the poor Scots, and therefore not taking any ransom and just killing them all. Actually, this is sort of a joke. I mean, it's not a real laws of war kind of thing,
and relies on the reader's sense of that wider context.
Yes. But it's definitely an ironic text, and that's just is sort of so surprising.
So we have about 15 minutes left for questions and further discussion, and I'm sure Mike and I both have questions that we could continue to ask Lorna, but I wouldn't want to deprive any of you who have questions.
You're absolutely right. I mean, in the process, in the 1540s, particularly under Protector Somerset, they did try that. I mean, part of it was simply the Reformation. I mean, one of the reasons Patten's text is ironic is because that kind of mockery was typical of Protestant writing about Catholicism in that period. So, I mean, Scotland was Catholic at that point. There's a wonderful slide of the Abbey of Kelso, and this may just be an opportunity to show just a couple of these. The abbeys were torn down. I mean, they sort of say that's the Battle of Pinkie. That's in the Bodleian, and that's a really nice. There's God helping the English, and there's the Scot there.
And the Scottish are so disorganised, and the English are so
organised.
I know,
yes. That's the moral. And I think if you go on, there's So this is Protector Somerset in 1545 at Henry VIII's command, and he's just giving his accounts of all the places he burnt, razed, and cast down in the Tweed Valley and on the River of Tweed. First, the Abbey of Kelso razed and cast down, and the town of Kelso burnt. And then at the very end of it all, and it goes on for 3 more pages, he says 247, abbeys, towns, blah, 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 burnt, razed, and cast down. So there's a sort of contrast between the very careful accounting and the destruction. But then I think the next slide might be, so this is Kelso. If you go to Kelso now, that's what you see, and it's enormous. You think, God, huge. That must be the Abbey. But that's just that tiny bit there, and all the rest of it was bombed, cannon fire. So that was a Reformation thing. They were trying to erase the culture, the Catholic culture. And so it was all conducted in that spirit of Protestant evangelism. And of course, there were Scots who were Protestant too. For example, the poet David Lindsay. I mean, there were Scots who were sort of on the side of English Protestantism, but they weren't quite prepared for, this amount of destruction. So I think that I think that's a very difficult thing always, because many historians point to Scottish Unionists, Scottish who want to be part of England, Scottish who want Protestantism, and of course they do, but not quite in this way, you know. So I think that's a difficult one.
The combination of that image of the Battle of Pinkie and Mike's earlier question about the kind of tessellated set of different kinds of sovereignty and culture across Scotland in the period is also a contributory factor to how difficult it is to imagine a Scottish nation, because it's so many different things.
That's right.
I mean, not to say that England is not so many different things in the period, but there's so many different possible jurisdictions. And one of the great things about your chapter on the Marian crisis, so the crisis of sovereignty when Mary, Queen of Scots, is imprisoned and they're trying to decide what to do about her, is that you bring together George Buchanan on the one hand arguing for
the
deposition, and on the other hand
the
Maitlands
wanting
showing
the constitution.
What I think you call two different forms of Scottish literary genius or something. There's some lovely phrase that you use of the two different modes of construction of the.
But I mean, back to Mike's point as well. I mean, the different kinds of jurisdiction, the different kinds of state formation. One of the things that Henry VIII was angry with James V about was that he wouldn't join with him in Reformation. Now, of course, we all know that Henry VIII's motives for Reformation were fairly venal, and we couldn't understand was that James V didn't have anything like the same motivation because of the way in which the Scottish Crown controlled the wealth of the church to a much greater extent than the English Crown had controlled the wealth of its church. So, you know, James just didn't see the point. You know, everything is fine.
He already had all that
money. He already had all that wealth. He didn't see the point of, you know, of getting rid of monasteries and taking their wealth. So that's just like a cultural misunderstanding on Henry VIII's part.
Yeah. This is also making me think about the phrase that you bring out, and which I was aware of in a general sense, of the rough wooings as the way of describing those wars of the 1540s, which is both a kind of political trivialization of what is happening, but also fits with your discussions of the eroticism of the Fairy Queen in the subsequent chapter.
Well, it is very interesting because I think I sort of link that to the trope of metalepsis, that the way in which the argument. Somerset was a great believer in rhetoric when he was pursuing the conquest, and he had all these proclamations written, which were, you know, highly rhetorical, which were explaining to the Scots how they, the English, with their 15,000 army and their ships and so on, didn't mean any harm, and they were just coming to woo, you know, to arrange a wedding between Mary, the infant Mary, and Edward, Henry's son. And they weren't going to do any harm. However, if anyone thought they were doing any harm or objected in any way, those people would, you know, feel all the force of the army, and they would have brought it on themselves. And so that's the sort of trope of metalepsis, you know. And so they went north, and they said, well, we made the proclamation, and they pinned the proclamation to doors and things. But they did blow up a lot of castles on the way up. Obviously, those people hadn't read the proclamation, you know. Or
had read it and disagreed with its terms.
Or hadn't come out with their hands up or something. Yeah. So that was the trope of, you've done it to yourselves, you know. We are actually coming to woo. We're coming in peace. And that was the reason
Which is, of course, it's self-fiction. You know, it's a story that is being proleptically told.
Yeah. Exactly.
Are there other questions from the audience?
I felt that it didn't perhaps convey the subtlety of what I thought was going on in the poetry, which has made us forget that there was any effort. So the thing I'm concerned, so the myth of indifference that I'm interested in is the myth that England is perfectly fine about Scotland and doesn't want anything, it has no problem with it. And then when James comes south, he, in an absolutist way, imposes Great Britain. And this is never an idea they've had, although the British history is an English imperial history. And so, in other words, the argument about James being absolutist and imposing Great Britain depends on a myth of indifference, of England's indifference to Scotland. So what I feel I've uncovered in the book is that the myth of indifference is very carefully cultivated, and it occurs partly through this literature which seems to make Scotland as a kingdom disappear. Another example is the history plays, Shakespeare's history plays. In the 100 Years' War, which Shakespeare treats in the play of Henry V, Scotland had an alliance with France. And after Agincourt, the Scots were the main military help to France. But you never have any sense, Shakespeare just talks about two mighty monarchies. You never have any sense that it's even possible that Scotland could be involved in this, that it could be a three-way war. So it's that kind of disappearance that I'm talking about. And I feel that erasure just sounds too much, too forceful, too much like a colonial process or something. And everyone has always said the colonial model doesn't fit Scotland, and they're right, it doesn't. This is something else I'm talking about. It's a kind of amnesia, really, or it's a disavowal might be another word. I feel that there's an English disavowal of their concern to control the sea boundaries of the kingdom. They were really concerned to do that, but they disavow it, which means that when James comes south, they can pretend that Scotland, having joined with them, hasn't brought them anything. Yeah. Whereas, of course, it's brought them tremendous security. Yeah. And I think it's the failure to acknowledge things like that. And I feel that that's, it's not an anti-union thing, but I just feel that feeling, I feel that failure to acknowledge is sort of problematic in the
I wonder if another way of getting at the complexities of erasure would be to talk a little bit about the coda to the book, which is about Macbeth, because in a kind of simple-minded way, you might say, well, how on earth could there have been an imaginative erasure of Scotland?
Yes.
Haven't you seen Macbeth? Yeah. So perhaps that's another way of getting at the complexity of imaginative work that is going on.
Yes. It's an extraordinary way in which that play kind of medicalizes or makes feel like a disease what is a kind of constitutional argument, an argument that really the Edward the Confessor ought to be a kind of overlord to Malcolm. I think the other thing that I found very interesting about that was the way that the Scottish materials themselves, Hector Boyce, as translated by Bellenden, but also John Forden, were actually extremely full of constitutional thinking. And that, in a way, Shakespeare erased that. Mm-hmm. So in the extraordinary episode of the testing of Malcolm by Macduff, the original of that in Forden has a political point. Mm-hmm. And Shakespeare makes it a three-stage sort of process that in the end is vacuous, has no point.
Yeah, it's interesting that you point out that critics often say that is a kind of weirdly, kind of Shakespeare put the brakes on in the middle of Macbeth in that scene by letting the kind of tension that goes through the play elsewhere dissipate in this English scene where there's a kind of a dispute. But it's something that goes throughout the book is the observation of arguments that are originally political constitutional becoming emotional literary. So the arguments about Mary Queen of Scots' motivations. I
know, that's Buchanan, yes.
But Buchanan brilliantly.
It's so interesting this, because this really is the way in which the literary can work to prevent the right questions being asked. I mean, the questions are not asked. So because basically Buchanan, having written de jure on the law of kingship, that the Scots have a right to depose, in order to justify the deposition of Mary, he wrote that. And then when Mary goes to England, Elizabeth is not going to be appeased by treatises that say people have a right to depose monarchs. So the Earl of Murray, who depends very much on Elizabeth's approval, has to find another way. And he asks Buchanan to write a sort of companion piece, which is a proof that Mary, and Mary alone, was responsible for the murder of Darnley, whereas in fact the entire nobility, including the Earl of Murray, were clearly involved. So Buchanan then writes this detection in Latin first, which is translated into a kind of Cod Scots by Thomas Wilson, Detection of the Doing of Mary, Queen of Scots. And it is sort of Senecan tragedy stuff, she is a tyrant. She's both kind of ludicrously transparent in her machinations and at the same time, sinister. But it's so effective. I mean, when I read it, I remember talking to Andrea about this. I sort of thought, well, I wonder if we could do an edition of it, perhaps, and have a play alongside about the propaganda campaign. But it's too difficult. It's too effective. I mean, when you read it, you just think, this woman is a monster, It's just impossible not to be affected by it.
Yeah. But also motivated by, kind of erotic obsession and by...
yes, her motives can't be
They can't be political. No, they can't be read as political because they can't be constitutional decisions. They have to be, purely kind of passionate
and that's why, as Stephen Alsford says, the Mary Queen of Scots has always been the preserve of sort of romantic historians rather than serious historians because of that way of telling the story. So that Buchanan's text has actually determined the questions we ask about it. And another question that nobody asks is just about the state of Scotland, Scotland's constitutional crisis. I mean, once Mary goes to England, everyone talks about the threat to England, Catholicism, so on and so forth. But no one thinks, well, what does it feel like to be in Scotland and, have a constitutional crisis of this nature? I mean, it just seems like amazing that question isn't asked, and it isn't. So, and again, that war is also represented as a civil war when it was, in fact, the military might was really English. The English were pretending to pursue the rebellion, the Northern Earls, the rebels from the Northern Rebellion, into Scotland. But in fact, they were punishing the supporters of Mary's restoration, the Queen's Party. And among them were the Maitlands, whose House of Blythe and the House of Lethington were both taken and spoiled by English troops. And in fact, Maitland poetry is always called household poetry, but it was Sebastian Verweij who said, it's a bit strange to call it household poetry since there wasn't a household.
Yeah.
Because it had been despoiled.
Speaking of questions that have not been asked, there is time for just one more if anybody has something that's on the tip of their tongue.
I suppose the vestige is the myth of indifference, that really dominates the fact that I don't know of a single literary critic who ever has mentioned this decade of war in the 1540s, I think, suggests that that's a heritage. So the heritage is the kind of moral narrative of politics that determines how people read English literary texts. So one example is the readings of King Lear. In Shakespeare's King Lear, Lear divides his kingdom, which is felt to be a terrible tyrannical thing that sets the whole horror in motion. And people always liken this to James, because James wanted to unite and make Great Britain. Now, for one thing, they're opposites. But for another, he wasn't particularly absolutist. He suggested it, it was refused, and then he went about, in a very constitutional way, setting up committees and doing other things like abrogating laws. So I think the heritage is this strange moral narrative that persists in the readings of literary texts.
Yeah. Do you have any reflections on the heritage of this?
No, there's other. Can I ask one?
Yes,
wait,
if the answer is relatively brief, you can.
No, I better not. I'll ask you afterwards.
Okay. Oh, no,
No, I think you should. I think you should.
Just,
No, do.
yeah.
So another historian's question is, running forward to late 1630s, you mentioned the collapse of English government, where there's lots of evidence that ordinary English people thought the Scots were right and didn't really resist a Scottish invasion. Kind of unprecedented. So it suggests that this erasure is successful in some areas of English life and not in others. And the obvious historian's question is class. You know, who are these?
Such a great question.
Who are these texts for? Who's reading them, and so on? You know that.
That is really great. I will think about that because that has not really occurred to me, and that is such a wonderful example of the unevenness, of the possible unevenness of this, and that really I might be talking about kind of high culture and a
court policy makers.
Yes,
and,
yes,
yeah.
and also that the temporality might not be. It might not be that made such a difference then. Those texts, Shakespeare and Spenser and so on, but that later Coleridge on, reading them has produced the kinds of readings we have now. That's really, really helpful. Thank you. Well, I mean, of course, one of the differences with Wales is that there isn't a different language, and it's always one of the arguments made that the Scots really should join with English because they have the same language. So I think that again shows you, one of the things that shows you is that you can't just do, as in that scene in Henry V, you can't just do archipelagic identity, Irish, Scots and Welsh, because each history is quite different. And so the issue with the Welsh is very much more one about language. And that's not the case with the Scots. Of course, there's Gaelic, but that really relates more to what Mike was saying about the Lord of the Isles and a kind of internal colonization. But and interesting, the people who set up the herring fishery, they were bilingual. I mean, they had bardic Gaelic poetry, and were able to go to Edinburgh and deal with the people in English as well.
Yeah. Great, thank you so much. It occurs to me in response to your question, another legacy of all of this is that we still think of, say, Mary Queen of Scots in a very literary vein, and she has been reproduced and produced as plays and opera and film more recently because Buchanan made her into a literary figure rather than a political one. But that was fantastic, Lorna. Thank you so much for writing this book and for so generously talking about it with us. I'm sure we all want to thank and applaud Lorna, and thank you all for coming today.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah.